So this is part of a series that tries to link some of the practical applications of research methods through grant writing, program evaluation, sort of program development, to kind of the research methods piece, and to sort of illustrate that research methods is sort of central to a lot of what we do as practicing social scientists in the nonprofit and public sectors. So I'll start with a conversation about grant writing. Grant writing is how a lot of organizations end up funding themselves. It's how governments and foundations get money out to different organizations that would actually do the work. And sort of the critical piece in sort of getting that money out is what's sometimes called a call for proposals or request for proposals, which is essentially somebody who has money, a government or a foundation, and has a specific goal that they want to achieve with that money, will put out a call and ask for proposals for how to go about achieving that goal. It's sort of a formal process for applying for that money. But I think it's worth pointing out that while you have sort of the specific language in those call for proposals, the specific language of what they're asking for isn't necessarily the whole story. There's oftentimes sort of unwritten rules or procedures. And so oftentimes when you get a request for proposal and you read through it and think, man, my organization could really do this sort of thing, or this would benefit my organization, this lines up really well with my organization's mission, that's sort of an invitation to reach out to the funding agency and say, hey, so I saw this. Let me introduce myself. Let me tell you a little bit about what we do at my organization. And this is the kind of direction I think I'm going and what we'd like to pitch to you. And they'll come back to you and say, yeah, there's a person on our board who really hates that. It's a good idea. A couple other people support it, but one person, they don't like that particular approach, or that particular direction, or that particular type of fund or program. Pitch us something else. Or they'll say, yeah, we've already got 2 organizations that are doing that. Can you maybe twist that a little bit and do something slightly different, or serve this population, or approach things this way? A lot of that call for proposal is an open door to finding partners that you can work with and that can compare and connect into what an organization is already doing. And so I think it's useful to kind of think about this not just as here's a legalistic document, offering money for a particular kind of services, but an invitation to build a relationship. And so this is, a really common method that's used by states and municipalities and private entities. And so it's worth being familiar with some of what the grant making process looks like if you're going to work in the public sector, broadly defined. So we've said lots of entities issue these kind of grants. There are online clearinghouses that you can look at. I flagged a couple that might be worth kind of digging through just to kind of get a sense of what these things look like and how they're structured. But it also is designed as sort of a way of interjecting sort of an element of competition into the public sector, right? Sort of that sort of reinventing government idea that you should be as nimble as the private sector, respond to incentives and that sort of a thing. And this is one way that can happen, right? That money is sort of out there and available, but different organizations are putting forward proposals and plans to use that money in a way that might be effective, and they get evaluated and assessed. And if they're doing well, maybe they get additional grants. And if they're not doing well, the money gets shifted over to somebody else who can use that money more effectively. So this is not just sort of governments lack the capacity to implement programs, and therefore they're using grant making. It's a way of actually trying to keep public sector money going to the most efficient and most timely sort of projects, and to kind of create incentives for organizations to work to deliver effective products for the government in terms of public service provision. I had mentioned that grant making is often an invitation to participate in a relationship. It's also an invitation to participate in a community. That organizations that give out grants oftentimes give out a wide variety of grants, and oftentimes have a wide variety of programs that they're involved in. And so part of pursuing grants is figuring out what that community looks like, figuring out how that community can support itself and each other, and figuring out how to sort of work within that community. And so a number of years ago, I attended a XX, American Cultural Center Exchange, which was a conference in China hosted by, hosted by the State Department, but I think paid for by the Luce Foundation, to bring together a variety of U.S. Universities that had partnerships with Chinese universities and were running cultural programming in China, financed by the State Department, to bring them together, to kind of have conversations about what they were doing, to find ways to collaborate, work together, so that if UND is paying to bring somebody over to China to do a presentation or a demonstration, that they can connect up with other universities in this network, and we can get 2 or 3 or 5 times as much impact out of that same dollar of airfare that was sent over. And so part of this network was to kind of tie all these different entities that were kind of working on the same problem together and help them to collaborate and work well. And I'm reasonably confident that if you are applying for one of these American Cultural Center grants through the State Department, and you don't participate in this network and you're not at this conference, your chances of rising to the top of the pool are probably going to be less. And your chances of knowing the kind of things that they're looking to fund, that they're looking for in a successful proposal, are going to be a lot less, because that's the kind of information that gets communicated out as part of these networks. And so when seeking grants, it's maybe not just a good idea to reach out to the grant making entity, but also to talk to other organizations that have grants through that entity, to figure out what they're doing that makes them successful, to figure out how what you want to do can support what they're doing, and to sort of learn from and build from each other. And although there's an element of competition in sort of this grant making process, oftentimes by design, it also tends to attract folks who are committed to particular goals and objectives and are willing to work with others to achieve those goals broadly. Okay, so a last little piece I'm going to anchor here before we pivot into some other conversations about research and grant making and program evaluation, is that a good grant proposal is going to ask you to accomplish a wide variety of research tasks. And so part of that grant may be a background or needs assessment, in which you're doing descriptive research, describing the situation, describing the problem, describing the environment that you're operating in. You may be asked to identify a target population, right, which is essentially a concept development, right? Who is the group of people that I want to work with, right? What is the situations that I'm trying to affect? What determines who's in that group and who determines who's not in that group? And that's a theoretical activity, a concept development activity, and we'll talk a lot about that. When you develop your approach and your methods, which is something we'll talk about here when we talk about logic models, that is a theoretical activity. That's a deductive exercise of sort of stepping back and thinking about the world and how it works and how you think you can effectively change that world based on your theory of how things operate. When you're developing your goals and your objectives and your tasks, those are all elements of concept development and operationalization. I'll sort of define what those are in a second here. And then you're also going to be asked to develop an evaluation plan, right? How would you know that you are achieving your goals, that you're meeting your objectives? How can you show us empirically and concretely that this is working? And that's a research design task, that you need to have a plan for how you're going to collect data, how it's going to be analyzed, how results are going to be presented. And they're going to ask for that upfront. And then lastly, you may need to conduct a capacity evaluation, which is, again, another kind of descriptive research where you're describing a situation, right? In this case, your organization. Can your organization actually carry out the kind of things that you're proposing that you're going to do? And that's something that, again, grant-making organizations are going to want to see and hear about. And to do that effectively requires paying attention to social science research methods. So it's sort of woven through the whole process, and you can't create an effective grant without sort of an understanding of social science methods. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with just a little bit of vocab and talking about grants. So I've been throwing around this word goals and mentioned that grant-making organizations will have goals that they want to see happen. Goals are big picture, abstract things, right? I want to promote democracy. Okay, well, that could go 100 different ways. Could you promote democracy? But that's sort of what grant-making organizations offer up. They say, here's a big picture thing, an abstract thing that I'd like to push for. And I want to see what people come up with for ways to advance that goal. And then you have objectives, right? Objectives are much more concrete, much more measurable things that you, a organization or an individual writing a grant or pitching a grant, are proposing you're going to accomplish, right? So maybe my way of promoting democracy is to register people to vote, right? That's a very concrete thing, right? That's maybe not the only way to promote democracy. Maybe promoting media literacy is another way to promote democracy. Maybe lobbying for voting reform so that people can get access to the ballot box, right? All of those are different ways to promote democracy, but they're going to have very, very different specific objectives that you're going to be working on as part of that grant. Your method is sort of your theory of change or your idea of how you're going to go about achieving that goal, right? And so you also have these tasks, or sometimes they're called activities, or sometimes it's just a statement of work, which is a very, again, very concrete list of here are the specific things that I'm going to do, right? And so if my goal is to, register people to vote, my tasks or my activities or my statement of work might be, I'm going to set up voter registration booths at these 10 events, and I'm going to staff them with 30 volunteers, right? Very, fine-grained detail. This is how this is all going to be accomplished and how it fits together. And in theory, there should be a story that you can tell with all of this, where you can lay out your tasks or your statement of work, and it should be very clear how that feeds into your objectives. And that's partly what your method is doing, is it's telling the grant making organizations, here's the link. If I do these things, I will achieve that objective. Here's the story about how that's going to work. And if I achieve these objectives, that's going to contribute to this larger goal that you have. And that method is the story, is the discussion that makes all of that fit together into a coherent structure. And having that sort of coherent structure is what allows grant making to work, in that we're going from these sort of large abstract goals and then funneling money to organizations that have a plan for how they're going to do specific things to achieve those big abstract goals.